If you've ever watched The Cosby Show, you remember little Rudy stepping up and belting out that unforgettable bay. Or maybe you saw Jamie Foxx and Ray bring to life the voice that shook audiences to their core. But here's the thing. Behind those iconic moments stood a powerhouse singer almost erased from history, Margie Hendrix. She wasn't just another background voice. She was fire, raw emotion, the spark that made Ray Charles's music explode with soul. Yet, while her scream echoed across America, her name faded into silence. How could a talent so undeniable end up forgotten? And how did her story take such a heartbreaking turn? Let's get into her story right now. Margie Hendrix was born on the 13th of March, 1935 inches, the small town of Statesboro, Georgia. For many people, Statesboro was just another southern stoplight town tucked away in Bullock County. But for Margie, it was the beginning of a journey that would carry her from dusty church pews to the brighter stages in America. Her childhood wasn't easy, and the odds stacked against her from the start. The South, during that era, was tough. Segregation, limited opportunities for black families, and poverty that touched nearly every household. Yet, even in the depression, middle of struggle, there was always music. Margie's earliest exposure came through the church. Like so many legendary soul singers, she cut her teeth in the choir. The church was where voices could soar without judgment, where little black girls with big voices were celebrated instead of silenced. From the first time she sang, it was clear Margie wasn't ordinary. Neighbors would stop by to hear that little girl with the thunder in her voice, and whispers started floating around town. That Hendrix child can sing. Her family wasn't wealthy, but they were tight-knit. Margie's mother encouraged her passion, and though money was scarce, support was strong. Growing up in Statesboro meant dealing with all the contradictions of the South, deep-rooted traditions, strong community bonds, but also systemic racism and few paths to real success. Music became Margie's way out, her lifeline. By the time she was a teenager, Margie had developed a voice that didn't just hit notes, it commanded attention. Friends recalled that she could switch from a tender gospel hum, a scream that rattled the rafters. That balance between softness and power would later define her signature style. But back then, it was just raw talent waiting for the right stage. Margie wasn't content staying local. Even as a young girl, she dreamed bigger. Stories from those who knew her paint a picture of a determined teenager who believed her voice could take her further than Statesboro's city limits. And she was right. She left home chasing music in a proscent time when opportunities for black women were few and far between. That decision wasn't just bold, it was almost reckless. To leave the safety of family for the uncertainty of the music world took courage, and courage was something Margie never lacked. The late 00940 decade and early 100,000 decade were transformative years for music. Gospel, blues, and jazz were all colliding. And from that collision, rhythm and blues began to take shape. Margie arrived right as the sound of America was shifting. Her childhood in the church had trained her ear, her lungs, and her spirit for this very moment. She wasn't just a singer, she was a vessel for everything her community felt, but couldn't always say. Pain, joy, struggle, and hope. All of it came pouring out of her songs. When she moved beyond Statesboro, she joined small vocal groups, honing her skills and learning how to blend her voice with others. But even in those early ensembles, one truth became clear. Margie wasn't meant to hide in the background. She had a presence that refused to be ignored. Other singers might carry a tune, but Margie carried fire, and whenever she opened her mouth, people turned their heads. Her upbringing shaped not only her sound, but also her spirit. Living in Georgia during those years meant confronting discrimination daily, but it also meant developing resilience. Margie learned to fight for her place, to carve out space where there seemed to be none. That fighting spirit would serve her well later, even though it sometimes came at a personal cost. By the mid-1950 decade, Margie was ready to step into a bigger spotlight. She was more than just a small-town girl with a big voice. She was a force waiting to be unleashed. And, as fate would have it, her journey would soon collide with one of the greatest musical figures of all time, Ray Charles. It's almost poetic when you think about it. A blind genius from Albany, Georgia, and a fiery young woman from Statesboro, Georgia, crossing paths at just the right time. Their union would create some of the most explosive sounds in American music. But before all of that, before the drama, the hits, a heartbreak, there was just Margie Hendrix, a determined young woman from the South, singing her way out of hardship and into history. Leaving Statesboro was just the first step. Once Margie Hendrix decided that music would be her destiny, there was no turning back. She knew her voice was her ticket out of small-town limits and into that world stage. With a suitcase full of dreams and a voice that could shake walls, she began hustling her way through the music circuit. Her earliest gigs came through local groups and gospel ensembles. Like so many singers of her generation, Margie cut her teeth, traveling from church programs to juke joints, learning how to adapt her voice to any room. In church, she could raise her voice to the heavens. In smoky bars, she could belt with a raw edge that cut through the chatter. That versatility was her weapon. Word started spreading about this Georgia girl who could out-sing just about anyone. She had a way of holding a note that made your chest vibrate, then shifting into a growl that felt almost dangerous. People said Margie didn't just sing songs, she lived inside them. And when talent like that starts making noise, opportunity comes knocking. By the late 1950 decade, Margie caught the attention of talent scouts and producers. She recorded briefly with a group called the Cookies, an all-female vocal act that had ties to the New York music scene. That move was pivotal. The Cookies gave her exposure, sharpened her stagecraft, and introduced her to industry insiders who recognized she was destined for more. Even within a talented group, Margie's voice stood out like a flare in the dark. Her big break came when she crossed paths with Ray Charles. Ray was already carving his name into history, blending gospel with rhythm and blues in a way that scandalized some but electrified many. He was building something new, something bold, and he needed singers who could match that fire. Margie was the perfect fit. Becoming one of the Raylette wasn't just another job. It was like joining a revolution. The Raylette were more than background singers. They were the soul that lifted Ray's vision higher, and from the moment Margie stepped into that lineup, it was obvious she wasn't just another Raylette. She was the Raylette. On stage, she was magnetic. She didn't shrink behind Ray. She stood toe-to-toe with him vocally, sometimes even stealing the spotlight. Audiences could feel the tension, the energy bouncing between Ray and Margie. When she sang, you could see heads turn, jaws drop, and hands clap a little harder. In rehearsals, Margie pushed herself and those around her. Fellow Rhett later admitted that she set the standard. If you couldn't keep up with Margie, you didn't belong in the group. Her confidence wasn't arrogance, it was survival. She had fought too hard to get here, and she wasn't about to fade into the background. Of course, being that bold came with consequences. The industry wasn't kind to women who demanded attention, especially black women. But Margie didn't care. She knew her worth, and she knew the Raylette wouldn't sound the same without her. This was the start of the rise. The moment when a girl from Statesboro transformed into a woman, commanding stages across America. Margie Hendrix had arrived, and the music world was about to find out just how powerful her voice truly was. Once Margie Hendrix stepped into the Raylette lineup, a group was never the same again. She brought a fiery energy that didn't just compliment Ray Charles, it challenged him. And nowhere was that more evident then on one of the most unforgettable recordings in rhythm and blues history. Nighttime is the right time. The track starts smooth, with Ray's voice carrying that bluesy calm. But then it happens. Margie bursts in with that legendary scream, "Bay!" It wasn't polished. It wasn't delicate. It was raw, passionate, almost primal. That moment turned a good record into a timeless classic. Listeners didn't just hear it, they felt it. Families across America would remember that voice. And even decades later, fans still point to that scream as one of the most electrifying moments in soul music. Margie's voice gave the Raylet an edge. They weren't just backup anymore, they were co-stars. She had a gift for turning simple harmonies into fireworks. On stage, audiences leaned in, waiting for the moment when Margie would take over, and when she did, it felt like an earthquake. One of the most famous examples came with "Hit the Road, Jack." Though not always credited front and center, the Raylet's sassy responses to Ray's pleading were the secret ingredient that made the song iconic. Margie's sharp, biting tone cut like a blade, turning the track into a call and response battle that defined Ray Charles's sound. Without her presence, that record wouldn't have carried the same punch. But Margie wasn't just shaping the sound. She was also shaping the energy between her and Ray. The chemistry between them was undeniable. On stage, you could see the sparks. Off stage, those sparks turned into a relationship, complicated, intense, and ultimately destructive. Still, in that moment, their connection fueled the music in a way that audiences could feel. Fellow musicians often recalled how Margie dominated rehearsals and recording sessions. She was unafraid to push Ray, sometimes clashing with him, but always bringing out his best. That tension was like lightning in a bottle, dangerous, unpredictable, but unforgettable once it hit tape. Margie's performances earned her recognition among insiders, but outside the music world, her name still didn't get the shine it deserved. People knew the scream, the sass, the fire, but they didn't always know it came from Margie Hendrix. That was the bittersweet part of her rise. Her voice was famous, but her name wasn't. Still, during these years, Margie was unstoppable. She toured with Ray Charles across America, thrilling crowds in clubs, theaters, and concert halls. The Raylet weren't treated like decorations. They were part of the main event, thanks, in large part, to Margie's powerful presence. She wasn't afraid to command the mic, to show the world that a woman could stand beside a genius and hold her own. Those late 1950 decade and early 1960 decade performances remain legendary. They captured a moment when soul music was exploding, when gospel-infused R&B was rewriting the rules of American culture. Margie Hendrix was right at the center of it, shaping history with every to note. Her rise had all the ingredients of greatness: the voice, the stage, presence, the passion. But greatness often comes with a price. For Margie, the same fire that made her unforgettable would soon ignite the conflicts that threatened to consume her. By the early 1960 decade, the world knew Ray Charles as the genius, and behind that genius stood a group of women who gave his music its soul. At the center of that fire was Margie Hendrix. Her voice had already carved out unforgettable moments on records, but it was the live shows that truly cemented her place in history. When Ryan the Raylet hit the stage, audiences weren't just watching a performance, they were witnessing a cultural shift. Margie's screams and shouts electrified theaters across the country. Fans came expecting Ray, but they left talking about that woman with the explosive voice. She embodied passion in a way few performers could, and the fact that she was a black woman standing front and center during a time of racial and gender inequality made it even more revolutionary. The music industry was evolving fast. Rock and roll was shaking the charts. Motown was rising in Detroit, and soul was taking root as the soundtrack of change. In this storm of innovation, Margie was right at the core. Her vocals on Nighttime Is the From Wall. Right Time weren't just notes, they were battle cries. They echoed in churches, in homes, and even on television. When the Cosby Family recreated the song decades later, it was Margie's voice. They were channeling proof of her lasting impact. Inside Ray's band, her role grew. She wasn't just singing harmony, she was shaping the sound. Ray himself knew her value. He gave her space to shine, letting her step out from the group when the music demanded raw energy. And when Margie delivered, she didn't just meet the moment, she owned it. The Raylet became iconic, a symbol of sophistication and grit. And Margie was their heartbeat. Younger singers looked to her as the standard, studying the way she balanced control and abandon, sweetness and fury. She was both mentor and competitor, raising the bar for everyone who shared a stage with her. But Margie's breakthrough wasn't just about music, it was about cultural presence. The early 1960 decade were turbulent years in America. With the civil rights movement gaining momentum, music became a weapon, a source of strength for Black communities, demanding equality. When Margie poured her soul into those songs, it wasn't just entertainment, it was survival, resistance, and pride. Her voice carried the weight of her people. Even if history hasn't always given her credit, record executives and critics might not have placed her name in bold print, but among musicians, Margie Hendrix was respected. They knew she was the secret weapon in Ray's arsenal. Without her, many of those songs wouldn't have burned the same way. And when people talk about the golden era of Ray Charles, they're also talking about the era of Margie Hendrix, even if they don't always realize it. This was her breakthrough. A young woman from Statesboro standing shoulder to shoulder with one of the most celebrated musicians in the world, shaping the sound of a generation. She had turned her pain, her passion, and her roots into something bigger than herself. Margie Hendrix had made it to the mountaintop, but as with so many great artists, the higher she climbed, the thinner the air became. As Margie Hendrix's star rose higher, so did the shadows around her. Fame, especially in the 1960 decade, was never just about the music. It was about image, politics, and the harsh reality of being a Black woman in an industry dominated by men. For Margie, the very qualities that made her unforgettable, her boldness, her passion, her refusal to shrink, also made her a target for criticism and conflict. On stage, she was unstoppable. Audiences couldn't get enough of her fire. When she locked eyes with Ray Charles in the middle of a performance, the electricity was undeniable. The crowd would erupt, sensing something deeper than just music. But off stage, that chemistry spilled into a relationship that became as volatile as it was legendary. Ray was married, yet drawn to Margie's fearless spirit. Their affair added fuel to their performances, but it also planted seeds of chaos that would haunt them both. For Margie being tied romantically to Ray, Charles meant visibility, but it also meant danger. Industry insiders whispered and fellow musicians watched as the line between professional and personal blurred. Some admired her fearlessness. Others resented the power she held in Ray's orbit. In the 1960 decade, women weren't expected to take center stage, and Margie did more than that. She stole it. The press rarely gave her credit, often reducing the Raylet to anonymous background singers. Yet, the audience knew the truth. They might not have remembered her name, but they remembered her scream. They remembered the way she sang with her whole body, like she was tearing open her chest and letting her soul pour out. That paradox, being unforgettable but unnamed, was the cruel irony of Margie Hendrix's breakthrough. Hollywood would later capture this dynamic in the film Ray. Regina King's portrayal of Margie brought her story to a new generation, showing the world both her brilliance and her struggles. But even in that film, her role was secondary to Ray. That's the way history has treated her, too. Essential but overshadowed. Inside the band, tensions began to build. Margie's assertiveness sometimes clashed with Ray's leadership. She wasn't afraid to challenge him musically or personally, and that made for explosive moments in rehearsals. The same fire that created magic on stage often created chaos behind the scenes. Still, those battles were part of what made the music so powerful. Lightning doesn't strike without friction. Margie's breakthrough years were filled with contradictions. She was celebrated on stage, but dismissed on paper. She was adored by fans, yet criticized by industry gatekeepers. She was both muse and outcast, partner and rival. And, while her voice was shaping the sound of a generation, her personal life was becoming increasingly unstable. This duality became her reality. The light of fame shining brighter than ever, while the shadows of addiction, heartbreak, and industry politics crept closer. Margie Hendrix had reached the top of the mountain, but the question was clear: how long could she stay there before it all came crashing down? By the mid-1960 decade, Margie Hendrix was living the kind of life that looked glamorous from the outside, but carried deep cracks within. On stage, she was a storm of fire, commanding the spotlight and leaving audiences stunned. Off stage, she was caught in a whirlwind of pain, love, and choices that would ultimately define her downfall. Her relationship with Ray Charles had become impossible to ignore. What began as chemistry in the music soon turned into a full-blown affair. For Margie, Ray was not only a band leader, but also the father of her child. That bond tied them together more tightly, but it also tore at the fragile balance between her professional and personal worlds. Ray was a married man, and Margie's demand for recognition as more than just a mistress created constant tension. The affair added a dangerous layer to her life with the Raylet. Jealousy, whispered gossip, and resentment simmered behind the scenes. Some felt she received favoritism. Others believed she was gambling with her career by standing so close to Ray. And Margie, never one to bite her tongue, didn't hold back when she felt slighted. That boldness, which once made her magnetic, began creating enemies in an industry where silence was often safer. Adding to the turmoil was Margie's growing dependence on drugs and alcohol. The same intensity that fueled her performances demanded an outlet off stage. Nights of partying blurred into mornings of regret, and the substances that seemed to numb her pain only deepened it. The music industry of that era was filled with temptations, and Margie found herself caught in its grip. For Ray, addiction was also a familiar demon. But while Ray managed to juggle his career, Margie's struggles hit harder. She didn't have the safety net of fame, wealth, or a massive support system. Instead, she was left vulnerable, trying to balance motherhood, a turbulent romance, and relentless demands of the music business. Friends and bandmates noticed the changes. Her once sharp discipline in rehearsals gave way to volatility. Some days, she would show up blazing with energy. Other days, she couldn't hold it together. The Raylet needed consistency, and Margie's unraveling state began to threaten the very foundation she had helped build. The tragedy was that Margie's voice never lost its power. Even in the midst of chaos, when she stepped up to the mic, she could still shake the room. That contrast, brilliance on stage, breakdown off stage, made her story even more heartbreaking. She had everything an artist could dream of: talent, recognition, a signature moment etched in history. But she was also fighting demons that didn't care about applaud. This was the beginning of Margie's conflict, a life lived in extremes where love and music intertwined with betrayal and addiction. She had risen higher than most women in her field could imagine. But now the very fire that fueled her rise threatened to burn everything down. As the 1960 decade pressed on, Margie Hendrix's storm grew harder to contain. What once felt like passion now turned volatile. Her affair with Ray Charles, once the spark that fueled unforgettable performances began unraveling in front of the very people who depended on them both. The arguments became louder, the distance wider, and eventually the fallout was impossible to ignore. Ray, who had built his empire carefully, wasn't willing to let personal chaos consume his brand. Margie's defiance, her unwillingness to stay in the shadows, clashed directly with his need for control. The tension boiled over during rehearsals, and even on stage where their fiery chemistry sometimes crossed into open conflict. For a while, that friction created magic, but over time, it became destructive. By the mid-1960 decade, Ray made a decision that would alter Margie's life forever. He dismissed her from the Raylet. Just like that, the woman whose scream had defined nighttime is the right time was no longer part of the band that had given her a place in history. For Margie, it was more than losing a job. It was losing her identity. She tried to rebuild. Determined not to fade, Margie pursued a solo career. She recorded singles like Restless and Nothing, but are songs that showcased the raw power of her voice. Critics who heard them knew she had the goods to be a star. But without the machine of Ray Charles behind her, the records failed to make a dent commercially. The industry that had once thrived on her fire now seemed unwilling to give her a chance on her own terms. The rejection hit hard. Combined with her personal struggles, it pushed her further into the grip of addiction. Margie's days became a blur of clubs, short recording sessions, and battles to keep her life afloat. Friends remembered her as still vibrant, still funny, still powerful when she sang, but weighed down by pain and disappointment. Motherhood, too, became more complicated. The son she had with Ray was a reminder of the love and chaos that defined her career. Ray supported his children financially, but that didn't ease the emotional weight Margie carried. She was a mother trying to hold on to dignity while the world seemed to close its doors around her. In 1973, at only 38 years old, Margie Hendrix's story came to its tragic end. Reports say she died of a heroin overdose. Others whispered about heartbreak, depression, and the cruel reality that the same passion which once made her unstoppable had burned her out too soon. Her passing barely made headlines, a devastating silence for a woman whose voice had once shaken America. That's the cruel truth of Margie's conflict. She rose like a flame, burned brighter than most, and was gone before the world truly realized what it had lost. The scream that once electrified audiences was silenced, but for those who heard it, it would never be forgotten. When Margie Hendrix's life ended in 1973, the news barely made a ripple. For someone whose voice had defined some of the most memorable songs of the century, the silence was painful. But history has a way of holding on to the truth, even if it takes decades to surface. Margie may not have had chart-topping solo hits, but her impact is woven deep into the DNA of American music. Start with Nighttime is the right time. That scream, raw, untamed, unforgettable, still sends chills down spines. Long after its release, the song has lived on through covers, samples, and pop culture. When The Cosby Show aired its iconic family sing-along scene in the 1980 decade, they chose song. Millions of viewers laughed, sang, and clapped along. But what they were really celebrating was Margie's spirit. She was the secret ingredient, the fire that made that record timeless. Then there's Hit the Road Jack. Every time those Raylet voices snap back at Ray Charles with sharp defiance, you hear Margie's influence. That sass, that bite, it wasn't background filler. It was storytelling, attitude, theater. Those elements helped shape how future artists approached backup vocals, transforming them from supporting roles into key players. Margie's vocal style influenced generations of singers who came after her. Arthur Franklin, Gladys Knight, Etta James, they all carried the teamy torch of soulful powerhouse delivery. While Margie's name might not be listed alongside theirs, Her presence in the soundscape they inherited is undeniable. Younger singers, especially women, learned that it was possible to sing with both vulnerability and ferocity. Margie had modelled that balance years earlier. Her story also became part of Ray Charles's larger legacy. Ray himself acknowledged the importance of the raylet in shaping his sound, and Margie was the most unforgettable of them all. To this day, when critics and fans revisit Ray's golden years, they inevitably circle back to the recordings where Margie was at his side. Without her, the magic wouldn't have been the same. Modern audiences continue to rediscover her. Thanks to YouTube, documentaries, and the film Ray, new generations are asking, who was Margie Hendrix? Viewers who only knew the scream or the sass are now uncovering the woman behind it. They're learning she wasn't just a supporting act. She was a pioneer who deserved her own spotlight. Margie's legacy also lies in the narrative of overlooked brilliance. She represents the countless women in music whose names were buried while their voices shaped history. When fans comment online about how she should have been crowned the true Queen of Soul, they're not exaggerating. They're recognizing the injustice of her obscurity. Even today, her voice is a rallying cry for artists who feel unseen. Every time someone belts out a note with unfiltered passion, every time a backup singer demands to be heard, Margie's spirit lives on. Her life was cut short, but her legacy is louder than ever. Margie Hendrix's story doesn't end with her death. In many ways, it began there. For decades, fans and historians have looked back and asked the same question. How could a woman with so much talent remain in the shadows? The answer lies in the complicated history of music, where brilliance is not always rewarded with fame and where women, especially black women, were often pushed to the margins. When people talk about singers who were underrated, Margie belongs at the top of that list. Her career mirrored that of Florence Ballard from the Supremes, another powerhouse whose voice helped define a group, but whose name was often forgotten. Both women remind us that fame isn't always fair, and that sometimes the loudest voices are silenced first. Comparisons to Arthur Franklin also arise. Arthur became the Queen of Soul, her crown undisputed, but listen closely to Margie's delivery. The grit, the passion, the ability to move from a whisper to a scream in a fendette heartbeat, and you'll hear qualities that were just as regal. Some fans insist that if Margie had lived longer, she might have been recognized as the true queen, or at least her equal. Instead, her legacy was left incomplete, like a book missing its final chapters. Her name also sits alongside Linda Jones, another gifted singer whose life was cut short. Both women carried voices that could stop you in your tracks. Yet both left the world too soon, leaving only fragments of what could have been. These parallels show us how fragile greatness can be, how easily history overlooks those who didn't fit into its narrow mold of superstardom. Margie's influence shines in subtler ways too. Every time the Raylet are remembered, every time people talk about the chemistry that made Ray Charles's music explode, Margie's spirit is there. She turned backup singing into an art form, proving that those voices in the background weren't just echoes. They were equal partners in the storytelling. Without Margie, the template for female vocal groups in R&B and soul would look very different. Fans today keep her memory alive. In comment sections, forums, and documentaries, people share how they first discovered her, maybe through the film Ray, maybe through an old vinyl, maybe through The Cosby Show episode that immortalized her scream. Each discovery feels like unearthing buried treasure, a reminder that true artistry never really disappears. Margie's legacy also sparks conversations about justice in the music industry. Why are some names etched in history books while others vanish? Her life forces us to confront those uncomfortable truths, and in doing so, she becomes more than just a singer. She becomes a symbol of all the artists who gave everything and received little in return. Underrated doesn't mean forgotten. Margie Hendrix may not have stadiums named after her or a long list of solo hits, but her voice lives on. It lives in the way modern singers push their vocals to the edge. It lives in the way backup singers demand recognition. And it lives in every fan who hears that babe and feels chills down their spine. She was more than a arlet. She was an icon hidden in plain sight, a queen without a crown. And now, little by little, the world is finally remembering her name. When you think back to Margie Hendrix, it always comes down to that sound, the scream, the fire, the lightning bolt of emotion that no one could ignore. She wasn't just hitting notes. She was channeling a force of nature. That's why even decades after her passing, people still talk about her as if she had just stepped off the stage. Her life was short, messy, and filled with contradictions. She was both muse and rebel, both star and shadow. She gave the world some of its most unforgettable musical moments. Yet the world gave her little in return. That's the tragedy of Margie Hendrix, but also her triumph. Because even without the fame, without the glittering, awards or the headlines, she left a mark that cannot be erased. Think about it. Every time nighttime is the right time comes on, Margie lives again. Every time. Someone belts out a note with unfiltered passion. Her spirit lingers in that echo. She may not have gotten the recognition she deserved in her lifetime, but history is slowly bending back toward her, as fans rediscover the woman behind the fire. So the question remains, if Margie had lived longer, if she had conquered her demons, would we be calling her the Queen of Soul today? Would her name stand shoulder to shoulder with Arthur Franklin, Etta James, and Gladys Knight? Or was her destiny always to be the hidden flame, the underrated icon whose brilliance shines brighter because it was never fully embraced? No matter the answer, one truth stands. Margie Hendrix mattered. Her voice mattered. Her story matters. She gave everything she had to her art, and in return, she gave us moments that will outlive all of us. She may have been silenced too soon, but in the hearts of those who know her story, in the voices of those she inspired, Margie Hendrix is still singing, and she always will.